Θα θέλαμε να σας ευχαριστήσουμε για τη σημερινή σας παρουσία. Ελπίζουμε να είναι και χρήσιμη η όλη διαδικασία των παρουσιάσεων και της συζήτησης. Ο ρόλος των δικτών ως μέσο ανάδειξης των εισηγμένων εταιρειών και ως εργαλείο υποστήριξης λήψης επενδυτικών αποφάσεων. Είναι η σημερινή μας εκδήλωση, ο τίτλος της σημερινής εκδήλωσης. Θα ξεκινήσουμε με μία παρουσίαση από τον κύριο Makepeace, ο οποίος εμβληματική προσωπικότητα του χώρου του financial industry στον ευρωπαϊκό και παγκόσμιο χώρο. Λίγα λόγια για την πορεία του, την επαγγελματική στο παρελθόν. Ο κύριος Makepeace είναι Group Director των Information Services του Χρηματιστηρίου του Λονδίνου. Είναι Chief Executive του οίκου FTSE Russell, όπως πλέον έχει ονομαστεί, και είναι μέλος της Εκτελεστικής Επιτροπής του Χρηματιστηρίου του Λονδίνου. Ξεκίνησε την καριέρα του το 1985 στο Χρηματιστήριο του Λονδίνου ως υπεύθυνος project manager ενός πολύ σημαντικού και με μεγάλη επίδραση έργου, ενός Big Bang έργου σχετικά με το deregulation της διαδικασίας διαπραγμάτευσης των μετοχών στο City του Λονδίνου. Το 1995 ίδρυσε τον οίκο FTSE International, με τον οποίο ξεκινήσαμε και τη συνεργασία στο χρηματιστήριο, και στα 20 περίπου χρόνια μακράς και βαθιάς εμπειρίας, δύο λέξεις χαρακτηρίζουν την εμπλοκή και την παρουσία του στο συγκεκριμένο χώρο. Είναι η αποτελεσματική συνεργασία χρηματιστηρίων, ακαδημαϊκής κοινότητας και ομάδων συμμετεχόντων στο financial industry της Ευρώπης και παγκοσμίως. Και η δεύτερη λέξη που το χαρακτηρίζει είναι το χτίσιμο αποτελεσματικών joint ventures. Ιδρυτικό μέλος του Index Industry Association και πρώτος πρόεδρος αυτού του association. Και τέλος, θα θέλαμε να σημειώσουμε τη μακρά και συνεχή του παρουσία ως υποστηρικτής προσπαθειών της UNICEF. Ο λόγος στον κύριο Makepeace για να ξεκινήσουμε τη σημερινή εκδήλωση. Mr. Makepeace, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your very kind introduction. It's an honour to be here and invited by the Athens Stock Exchange, because it is a long history. I think in business it isn't very often that you're celebrating partnerships that go back 20 years. Particularly when you're a company that only has a history of 22 years. So for most of our lives as a company, we have been working with the Athens Stock Exchange. And we're very proud of that. In fact, for 2 decades, I mean, we created, back in September '97, we created the beginnings of an index, I think, series for this market that was very advanced. And I think any market in the world, and any major market in the world, would have been proud at the way in which the indices allowed investors to begin to see how the different parts of the market were performing, how they really brought sort of international standards here. And in those early discussions when I was sitting with the committee in those days, the regulators, the exchange, the discussions were all about how we bring international standards, how we improve governance, how we bring indexation to this market. So it was very forward thinking. So coming back 20 years later, and having seen the changes that this market, as many markets have gone through, quite profound changes, and to see you beginning to come out the other side, I think is very rewarding. In my comments, I'd like to just talk a little bit about not just the partnership, but a little bit about benchmarks, index providers, and some of the benefits for both the market participants and the listed companies. And before I sort of get into those comments, it is worth mentioning, to celebrate those 20 years, we have announced today with the Athens Stock Exchange a new dividend index for this market. So again, we're bringing new products which have proven themselves in other markets and give investors an opportunity to really focus on the companies that are generating much higher levels of cash. So if I say a few comments about the growing importance of benchmarks and global index providers. The role of global index providers is becoming more important. And as we establish global market standards which are there to help all investors, both active and passive, this is increasing the usage of these benchmarks. And in fact, the index industry, like many other industries around the world today, has been consolidating. There are three major players today. There is FTSE, now FTSE Russell, there is MSCI, and there is S&P. These are large companies who now service asset owners and institutional investors worldwide. And between us, these three companies, our indices are now used by almost $40 trillion of assets that follow our indices. I mean, it's a staggering sum of money, and that's what we can identify through public means. In fact, FTSE Russell has the greatest amount of assets following its indices, some $15 trillion that follow our various benchmarks that we create around the world. And I'm often asked about the influence of passive, and passive is having an influence. But of these funds around the world, some 80%, or if I'm precise, 79% are actually actively managed. So indexation at the moment, if I look globally, accounts for some 21% of those assets. So it's got a long way to go. And if you look at some of the more developed markets like the US, you'll find indexation much higher levels. You know, over 30% of the market is now indexed. But that's in an environment where costs have become very important. And indexation is seen as a way of reducing the costs for those institutional investors. But when you move into other markets, where those markets, because of their size or the efficiencies in those markets, and that includes other asset classes like bonds, you'll find levels of indexation are much lower. And they're seen as markets where active managers have greater opportunities to outperform. So these three big global index providers, I mean, they've become very large and it's become a scale business, and we work with exchanges around the world. But what makes us really different is that it's not about the calculation of the indices, but it's about the industry standards that we're setting. You know, how do you determine whether a company should be included in your global portfolio? How do you, which industry would you put it in? How would you differentiate the markets? All of these things are determined really by FTSE and MSCI. And they're determined with the help of institutional investors. In fact, the largest institutional investors in the world all sit on our advisory committees. And it's the same structure that we have here in Greece. We have an advisory committee with important people who are helping set standards for this market. Globally, it's the same concept. We have these advisory groups of the most important institutional investors, consultants, asset owners, who are helping set these standards. So I'll give you an example. In the US recently, we decided that companies that come to the market and this is happening in the US in particular, where they come to the market without any voting rights for shareholders, therefore depriving shareholders of the ability to influence the companies by taking public stances on voting. That was removed by Snap. We had enormous pressure and influence from all of our institutional users who wanted to see that prevented. So we introduced a rule where we demand at least 5%, which is a very small amount, but it does give transparency. And that set a standard. And that's caused other companies who were in the pipeline to think very hard at the corporate standards that they were introducing. And that shows the power of industry standards where the institutional investors are an integral part of setting those standards. Closer to home, if I think about Greece, and I think about the setting of standards and facilitating access to the Greek market, particularly for global investors, the Greek market has a very healthy and large interest from international investors. I think last time I looked, it was over half the market is international investors. So it brings liquidity to the market, and there is a lot of interest. And in fact, just recently, I noticed in the FT, BlackRock was saying how the Greek market, in their eyes, was now a market which was showing some of the strongest growth and some of the strongest opportunity, which is very encouraging. But we, at FTSE, we do see a major shift in global market capital and development that is happening around the world. I think it's too simplistic to say it's moving from developed to emerging, but there is a huge shift that is going on. If I just use those simple definitions of developed and emerging and look to the World Bank suggests that by 2050, around 50% of global capital will flow from emerging markets. And we are seeing this huge shift. Emerging markets today represent about 6% of a global portfolio. But as we project forward and we look at some of the emerging markets that are going to become available as they remove capital controls, you're going to find emerging markets will probably represent 30% or more of global portfolios within 10 years. And that will almost have investors trying to rethink their definitions and how they look at countries in this, at the moment, quite simplistic way. So, as I look at these benchmarks and the standards that are being set, that there are clear benefits to using these benchmarks, and that's both for active and passive investors. In the case of emerging markets, we provide a path for international investors to access these markets and help set and monitor governance standards and frameworks as these markets mature over time. There are benefits to individual companies as well. Benchmark inclusion can be an important step for a company to gain more visibility and access to global markets. For Greek-listed companies, inclusion in the FTSE Ethics indexes, as well as the FTSE and MSCI emerging market indices, bring a level of passive investors who will hold the stock at their index weight, and they provide stable, long-term investors. In fact, if I look at emerging markets and going back to figures which are publicly available, you can see the MSCI emerging market benchmark has about $250 billion, which is passively managed against that. FTSE's emerging market index has about $160 billion, which is passively managed against it. I mean, these are large sums of money, but the amount that is actively managed is probably at least 10 times that amount, because again, there's a much higher level of active involvement. And index inclusion does impact active managers' selection choices, because active managers, their investable opportunity set is very often determined by the index. Doesn't mean they have to hold all the companies, but the larger active managers will hold a majority of those stocks and simply take decisions to overweight or underweight relative to the benchmark, and in that way manage their risk to the market. So index inclusion for companies is important, and it is also a very valuable tool for both active and passive managers. I'd also like to say just a few words about some of the recent challenges and signs of progress for the Greek market. We do run a very objective process for classifying global markets. During the last, or since the financial crash, we worked very, very closely with ATHEX in determining how we would classify the Greek market. And it was a difficult time. And our decision on making the Greek market in terms of recognising it as an emerging market was very much driven by market instability within Greece at the particular time. And factors which included extended market closures because of some capital controls, the imposition of those capital controls, and the continued economic instability driven by the Greek debt crisis. But I would say the Athens Stock Exchange has one of the best infrastructures that exists for many, many exchanges. And they should be applauded for the structures that they do have in place, the governance standards that they help promote. I mean, these are developed level status. And I do see that as signs of the Greek market show signs of improving, I think it will be a route back to developed. And I look at some of these positive signs. The economic sentiment indicator in Greece is up sharply since 2015. GDP growth, while still low, has moved into positive territory. The 10-year government bond yield has fallen back to levels last seen in 2009. And the banking industry, a sizable proportion of FTSE ATHEX large cap, is doing much better as the economy is stabilising. The IMF recently issued a more optimistic outlook on all non-performing Greek loans. So we look at the Greek market and we hope that going forward, that this year's performance, which is one of the highest performing stock markets in the world, we believe has further to go. And as I look ahead, it's impossible to predict what will happen in the next 20 years, just as we could not have foreseen the incredible global market changes in the last 20 years. But one fact is certain, there will continue to be a great deal of market change, and the need for standard setting by global index providers like ourselves, and the need for us to work with the local exchanges and regulators to help establish those standards locally will become more and more important. This need for strong governance will only increase as equity and fixed income markets become more interconnected and complex, and capital moves across the world more freely and quickly. And we have seen some trends that perhaps reverse that, but we believe in the long term those trends will continue. And this model does require strong collaboration, and that's why I believe FTSE Russell and ATHEX will continue. And I probably won't be here myself in 20 years' time, but I certainly hope my successor will be. It is important that we continue to work together to maintain this framework for setting of standards that improve all markets for the benefit of all issuers and all investors. And that's a driver of us. The partnership of FTSE Russell and ATHEX, I think, is also an important one for the Greek market. It is also, I'd like to say, a very important one for FTSE Russell and the London Stock Exchange. So thank you very much.